Welcome to Arts First, the podcast that stands up for freedom of expression in the arts and art for art's sake. I'm Niall Crowley. What we see isn't always black and white. It's the title of an exhibition currently showing at the Warrington Museum Art Gallery by Manchester-based artist and photographer Steve Forrest. For more than 3 decades, Steve has covered foreign wars, photographed Hollywood celebrities, artists and politicians, commissioned by major news organisations and papers such as the New York Times, and he's worked as a photographer for UK and foreign governments, the United Nations and international NGOs. An impressive portfolio. According to the museum's website, the exhibition is an examination of the artist's own analogue and digital documentary photography archive. But it's actually much more than that, as I hope we'll discover, because I'm really thrilled that Steve is with us today to talk about the exhibition. Joining us too is Pauline Hadaway, academic and researcher, and Pauline's also the former director of the Belfast Exposed Photography Gallery. Steve and Pauline, welcome to Arts First, and many thanks for joining us. And congratulations, Steve, on the exhibition. I didn't manage to get to the opening, but I'm quite familiar with your work and your career, which is obviously long and varied. Could you kick off by telling us a little bit about the exhibition, about your work, and about what you were trying to do? Because it's not simply a retrospective, is it?
No, I think I have had thoughts about trying to do a retrospective of the walk and my varied career, but for some reason it just didn't all seem to sit well with me. It was more like me just showing something from the past that just stayed in the past, that was just a fraction of a time that passed, that may be of interest to some people and not of other people. And I'm also thinking of the celebrity portraits I spent time doing for the New York Times, in that they were of a time, if you like, and to bring them back solo now just seemed a bit too easy and not particularly interesting for me. I've always been interested in photo-montage, even before I think taking on photography. I've always been interested in the period in Germany, the Weimar, and the early stages of the Russian Revolution, and where photo-montage was used to get across political points. So that's always stayed with me throughout my career, but obviously the day job takes over. And it wasn't until 2015, 2016, when I completed an MA, an MFA at Goldsmiths in London, that I started to explore more photo-montage. After the MA, that was great. I was very excited with which could be a new direction. However, I got the day job back and I continued doing the photography, traveling. So I didn't pay much attention to carrying on with the work that I started there. However, COVID threw the great big spanner in the works of my career and basically cut off all overseas travel for at least a year. On that, I took over a small studio in Manchester in an old mill and decided to mess around and revisit some of the subjects I was looking at on my MA. And I was fortunate enough to get a Arts Council DYCP grant, or Develop Your Creative Practice grant, which allowed me some financial security while I investigated more about montage. And then it was, then I couldn't stop, basically. I was just delving into my archives, cutting things out, putting them with other images, cutting prints out, scanning images, and just creating everything without much of a direction. They just happened as I was going along. This exhibition is a reflection of that time spent there and the last year where I've been encouraged to do more of it. I've had more time, and it's given me an opportunity to explore my archive even more and come up with some new ideas, of which are in the exhibition. And it's looking at the areas in between what we say at the moment is the polarised views of the world, where everybody's shouting their own ideas, not listening to the other ideas, and the other side is doing exactly the same. Nobody seems to want to meet in the middle, and we all seem to be trapped, not all of us, obviously, but a lot of people seem to be trapped in their bubbles and echo chambers. And this exhibition is more of an exploration to see if there's areas in between and to show works that people could either have their views reinforced or rejected, and they may not even know which one it is. And I've done that using these montages.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Steve. That was really interesting. Pauline, would you like to share your thoughts?
Okay, well, I went along to the opening night, which was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. I'll come back to that in a minute. But I was initially really drawn to this exhibition and the questions it posed. And that was really just from reading the program notes at the start, which is quite unusual because the program notes usually put you off things, or they actually they're so unclear, you're not quite sure whether you really want to see it or not. But as soon as I read the program notes, I knew this was something I wanted to see. And the exhibition obviously is mainly photo montage, and it's made entirely of images clipped from the artist's own collection. I think that's really important. And because that collection really is the product of a career in news and documentary photography spanning 30 years. And that's really substantial. That's a very substantial archive. And it poses a question. And this is the question that really interested me. Once freed, and I picked this up in the program note, once freed from the constraints of the documentary form and placed among other images from different times and places, can these archive photographs tell us something new about the past, the present, and the future? And that question really awakened my interest as someone who had been working in photography in Belfast after the Good Friday Agreement. And I'm not a photographer, but I was the director of Belfast Exposed Gallery. And I was working for many years, about 15 years, I think we worked on this, with curators and photographers and audiences, trying to build something new in the city. And what that thing was a contemporary gallery that was able to respond to changes that had been occurring throughout the whole of the long peace process. And for many years, photographers had been growing more conscious of the limitations of documentary or news photography and its inability to register new political and social realities. And this frustration, I think, was forcing a shift towards art photography, which of course was a huge benefit to us in the gallery, because we were then able to see the archive not just as a repository, but as a resource for new and freshly authored work, where people could explore the question, what kind of future is emerging from 3 decades of conflict? And so it was that for that reason that I was just immediately drawn to the questions posed by this exhibition, and also by the idea of Steve searching back through his archive and snipping out shapes and figures and playing around with them, building these fantasy worlds. Because there really is so much to see in these pictures. So you've got to look hard and close. It's not an exhibition where you can just glance and then move on. There was actually a really slow progress around the gallery. People moving around in pairs and small groups and talking and then going back for another look. And I just wanted to talk about really 2 series, if you like, of pictures. The one, fighters. These are pictures that they're composed in layers, I would say. So you have photographs of the late 17th century ceiling frescoes at Chatsworth House in the background. And then in the foreground, Eritrean fighters wielding Kalashnikovs. And the foregrounded figures have really beautiful faces. And it's so poignant because you can see that some of these people are little more than boys and girls. And behind them, these frescoes, which I looked them up because I wanted to find out more about them. They're called The Return of the Golden Age. I believe they were painted between 1691 and 1692, and they are celebrating the new order of that time, the Glorious Revolution. And these frescoes are just saturated with political messages and allegories of civilization and expressions of power. And then you see something else in these pictures. Small figures, more fighters, seem to be standing guard over what look like little tubs of minerals and coal, diamonds, gold. And they're such rich pictures because you've got so much to look at in there. And each of the different layers of pictures, of photographs, kind of speak to each other, not just in terms of sort of what it all means. And there's clearly references to the beautiful Chatsworth House frescoes. are a kind of also a mask of power and kind of ruthlessness, and that history casts a great long shadow over the present. There's all of this in there, all of these meanings. But you also see in the figures, from the gestures they make and the way that they look out of the picture and gesture to us, that you see this crossover across centuries and across continent of these people. And then there's another picture in the Fighters series, and that's a Palestinian fighter and an IDF man. Both are armed, and both, again, are facing sort of out of the picture, and both have their faces covered. And then behind them is a photograph of what looks like an ancient Assyrian stone frieze. And layered over that is a political mural of an angry woman and a child in pain. And then there's a religious man standing, reading from a book. And again, it's just so much to see in these pictures and so much to try and make sense of, so much history. There really is no invitation to take sides, although I think it's very hard to resist. And I did see a number of people actually having arguments and getting annoyed because they said they didn't like the message. It was quite interesting that some people were having arguments that they saw something in the picture than the people they were arguing with. I also love the Brexit frieze, which is another really collection of people and places. It's clearly about class and history and about the polarization of the referendum. And there are rows of buildings and streets, and you've got toffs and snobs lined up on one side, really, and then you've got ordinary people on the other. And then there's Boris crouched on top of a roof of this dilapidated row of terraces. And I was sort of thinking, I wonder if he's thinking, which way shall I jump? But I really warmed to those pictures. There's a whole series of pictures which I think really caught the spirit of Englishness. They were showing, there was a number of them showing all sorts of different moments of crisis in Britain. And you got the sense that, okay, this is a class-ridden, nostalgic, fusty, falling apart sort of a place where people are obsessed with class and royalty and celebrity and all of these things. But it's also a country that's full of exuberance and theatricality, where people have a great sense of the absurd. And it's about people wanting to stand out from the crowd. And I said to Steve, actually, at the opening, that I was particularly fond of the man who was making a show of himself in the street. He'd taken his shirt off and he was throwing shapes and dancing. And I think he kept cropping up. He sort of kept wreaking havoc in this series by turning up. I think one of the strengths of this exhibition is that the photo-montage is actually a product of decades of thinking and planning and making photographs during a substantial career in photography. What you're calling the day job, Steve, is actually, all about traveling, as you said, and planning and thinking and making photographs. And you can see it in the archive. So you can see that the artist is someone who, takes photographs for a living, but really has something very important that they want to say about human and social experience. And I think are already saying it in their, what you might call straight documentary and news photography. Whatever the limitations of documentary photography, it is possible to say things, I think, important things about human and social experience. So my question, Steve, really relates to your decision to move from news and documentary photography into the art world. From the another one of the images in the exhibition, quantitative easing, suggests that your view of the whole economics of the art world is, to put it mildly, satirical. And it's a picture of Damien Hirst's shark being pumped with formaldehyde as a sort of metaphor for the zombie economy, but it could be vice versa. I'm guessing that you started your journey with your MFA in Goldsmiths, and that piece, which was also shown in the exhibition, The Death of Photography, shows freelance artists putting the finishing touches to a Jeff Koons painting in a London gallery. And then the background photograph is of a dead Eritrean soldier. And I understand, I read that the battle in which he died had actually resulted in the death of tens of thousands of people. So what is the motivation? Moving from a job that brings you face to face with very serious and disturbing realities into what is actually often quite a shallow and artificial kind of a place where people make believe and build their fantasy worlds and careers. And I wondered if, are you searching in that archive? Are you in that archive looking for clues about the present and the future? Or are you laying to rest some of the ghosts from the past?
That's a very good question. I think it's probably a mixture of both. Together with the demise of newspapers, newspaper photography, they very rarely now commission photographers to go abroad. There are very few photographers make a living doing documentary photography. So even if I'd wanted to do that, I would have had to go and live somewhere where there is news in order to carry on photographing there. The limitations for that is that one is mental, in that I no longer believe that dramatic documentary photography can change people's minds. And I think that's because when I glance through Instagram daily, I'm bombarded with images, particularly in the recent conflict in Gaza, supporting one side only. And what disturbs me is that there are no supposedly Western or neutral journalists within the Gaza Strip, for a start. And I'm mentioning the Gaza Strip because that's where I started my journey in documentary photography. And I think it's telling that people are believing, I mean, it's a bit of a cliche to say that people believe what they see on Instagram and read on Facebook, but I think it's what people want to believe. Wherever they see it, they'll say it's right. So if, for instance, there's a piece that doesn't agree with their thinking or their politics, then they just won't believe it. It'll be fake news. So I think it's now, I did some research while I was doing this, in between doing some of my pieces, and I was looking at where my photographs have appeared. Basically, I was trying to chase anybody using my images that haven't paid for them. And I'd found out that my images, that a lot of the work I did when I was in Eritrea, I worked for Agence France Presse, AFP. I got paid very little, but that's what they paid, $50 a day to risk your life. If they use it, they'll pay you. If they don't use it, they don't pay you. But it did give me access to transport and journalists and to be able to get around. But during my research last year, I actually found out a load of images on Getty Images selling for hundreds of pounds. Whether they've been used or not, I don't know. I have no say in that. They've obviously got a deal with Getty, AFP. So I don't see anything financial from that. But also, I found images relating to the current or the most recent war where Eritrean soldiers went into Ethiopia to prop up one side of sort of civil war going on there. And so my images were from 20 years before, but propping up 20 years later as an illustration of Eritrean soldiers in Ethiopia. Now, to the observer, it's the same ground, the same country. It's not, there's no Eiffel Tower there, so you don't know where it is. It could be anywhere, basically. So I found that interesting. But I think the way of going through the archive for me was, in a way, to put some of the horrors I experienced in Eritrea to rest. And I tried for 4 years when I was doing my part-time at Goldsmiths to do that, and I was unable to do that. It was almost like they didn't want to be brought out of the past. They wanted to stay buried. And I felt almost guilty bringing them back to life if I could. So every time I tried, they seemed to resist themselves. And I think that's why I moved on to the living, well, I hope are still living soldiers from various conflicts, to show that there was life as well as war. So I found that it was hard for me to go back then and show the horrors, and I think that can easily turn people off anyway. So I think I like the idea of giving these fighters whose names I never got. It was all very quick and all very sudden. A stage, if you like, a stage, another world. Although obviously they have probably very little chance of leaving that country unless it's on a boat or escaping somehow. So I very rarely started anything off with a real view. I went through the scanning process, which the Arts Council helped with the funding of getting a good scanning system up. And I found things that interested me as a shape and an idea. So I actually didn't retouch most of the photographs I dug out of the archive because it wasn't necessary to make them perfect anymore. They were going to be part of something bigger. I started with scissors and just cutting out and putting together and sticky tape and that. And then I think when I've got an idea, rough idea, then I start using Photoshop because of the details. It's just impossible to do with scissors. So I was never a fan of Photoshop. There was an intention not to distort anything, but just to cut around a part of the image that I wanted to use for something else. So it's just been, I wouldn't say an evolution, it's just a messing around of looking everywhere I possibly can. And I've not even started on about 20 years of my career yet of looking through photographs. And there, what I'm really interested in is looking at when I was a local photographer in Oxford, photographing children's tea parties and biggest sunflower awards and things like that. So I'm curious to see where they'll sit in a montage, and that could be, for me, it could be quite interesting to see if they'll be able to go somewhere new. To go back to the point on the man in the man with no shirt on, that was at a time just after the Manchester bombing at the Manchester Arena. These two clearly alcoholics with their bottle of beers did a mural, "We Love Manchester," and they were actually dancing. This guy with his wig on was dancing, and getting strangers were actually coming up to him. And for a time, people weren't just looking at these people like they're going to throw money at some poor alcoholic or a tramp or something. It was, what surprised me is they actually engaged with him. It could have been opportunistic to get some money, but I actually felt there was a real feeling that there was a desire by everybody in Manchester after the bombing to actually make people feel a bit better about the city and about each other. And there was a coming together from that I've very rarely seen when, and they clearly weren't street artists. At normal times, probably not doing what they were doing then, but there was a big effort. Call it a financial opportunity maybe as well, but also something unique in Manchester. And that's why I put those, there were two guys, one in the background, I put them in all throughout the series, the 5 series I've done on class, to represent I don't know what the right word these days is, the lower class or the left behind, what it used to be called. And I thought that they continue whatever government's in power, and they also bring something or can bring something to society as a whole. And they're clearly unaffected, some are largely unaffected by whatever government's in power and what's behind them.
Really interesting contributions, both of you. When you mentioned the joked about the day job, I was thinking before I had a good look at your montages, which just really jump out at you. I mean, it's interesting what Pauline says about the layered detail of it. I can't wait to see them up front, but just looking at them on screen, they're incredible. And I'd seen some of your war photography in the past as well, and I know that some of the areas of your work over the years, and it's like they've all just crashed together with it just made me think of like the Hadron Collider of photography or something, and come up with something new. That's what really interested me. I never doubted you, but it was that's really interesting what you've done. And it wasn't, they're more than a repeat of kind of 20th century montages. You're not going over the old ground. You are, I mean, I'm not sure I can put my finger on it in quite the way that Pauline did, but they're very fresh and interesting images, and it gives me real hope for today, because we're in a time when politically, socially, everything is kind of upside down. So I think it's quite, really interesting what you're onto. Pauline, did Steve begin to answer any of your questions?
I'm glad that the shirtless man was on the right side of history. I'm glad he wasn't a complete ne'er-do-well, and that he had his, because I could see it in him. He was lovely. He had a warmth. I would run a mile from him in real life, but it was great to see him in the picture, cavorting. Yeah, he's a kind of everyman, I thought. When you were talking, Steve, I was thinking, of those figures in Bruegel and Dürer. You see these sort of almost archetypal, peasant, pre-modern people, and they're always busy doing things. There's a wonderful Bruegel painting, I think, with people running around with ladders in the background. And you're actually more interested in what they're doing with those ladders than you are in the bleak story being told in the foreground. So I think he's in that vein. The other thing was about the local, that I think that's a really nice idea, that you would look at, an archive of local photographs from your own collection. Because actually seeing that exhibition in Warrington was great. It was a great place to see it. Because I travelled up from Liverpool, I got the train up, and then walked through Warrington, from Warrington Central to the art gallery. And actually walking back, I realised I'm kind of walking through a montage here, because, you've got a mixture of buildings, Victorian, 1950s, sort of millennium-style buildings. There's a great jumble of different styles. And they're all slightly faded. And there's a great mix of people walking around those streets from all over the world, from locals from Cheshire, is it, or Lancashire, from Warrington anyway, and also people from all sorts of different continents, and who've made that their home. I did get the feeling that I'm in a sort of place where time and place has been thrown up in the air and it's come down as Warrington. And also with a rather grand past, in a way, of Victorian commercial trade and manufacturing and so on. So that was a nice place to have it. And when you said, you're interested in working with local photography, I think that's a great idea, because these sort of peripheral towns are really important. And I think, again, going back to this idea of the sort of spirit of England, they summon it up for me. And they managed to sort of, for me anyway, elicit a sort of great warmth and love for them. I was thinking, I wouldn't mind living in Warrington. It's quite nice. And we went for a drink afterwards, and it was very nice, actually. And yet they're not ever in the foreground. They're not big cities. Just one other thing was the actual art gallery space. That was a lovely space, because you had to walk through the museum as well. And you walked through collections of dinosaur bones and little sort of tableaus of a Victorian kitchen, shockingly a 1960s kitchen. Now, concerned history, so I recognised everything in it. You're walking through little tableaus and scenes, and it's a lovely it complemented the show so well. Steve, when you were talking about going into this material and not really thinking what you were going to get out of it, you were just sort of searching through it, not particularly knowing where it was leading. And I think that's probably, that explains a lot. And it explains, I think, one of the strengths of this collection. You are, in a sense, or you were, just letting the evidence lead you. You weren't going in with any preconceived or predetermined outcome. You're looking through the material and you're going where the evidence leads. And I think that's a great way of working, actually. I hope you'll spend many, many more hours, weeks, probably years, going through all that material you have and seeing where it leads you.
Steve, could you give us your last thoughts and maybe tell us when the exhibition is on till and maybe what we've got next?
The exhibition runs until the 30th of March. At present, there's no plans yet where it'll go next, although I am looking into places. I'd quite like to have an exhibition somewhere in another place in the north, in Manchester perhaps, before bringing it down to London and scaring the hell out of people down there, who I'd say a lot of people not used to being bombarded with such confusing work. So I'll be interested to see what reception it gets down there. My intention would be to offend everyone. And soon I'll be going back into my studio How I do my montages is basically how I do my photography. And it's whatever I'm doing, whether it's a portrait or a conference or in the past, a news photography, I close my eyes more or less before I take a picture. I never really concentrate on what I'm doing because I'm looking at shapes. And I find myself, if I concentrate too hard with one thing, and that includes portraiture as well, then I'm not ready to be spontaneous. It's a bit of a risk, but it allows for spontaneity and it allows for things to come into your work that you hadn't preconceived. And I think I like the idea of that. It's a kind of, some would say it might be risky in a way that you never quite know what you're going to get, but I know my mind, I know how messy it is, I know where everything is, and it's all over the place. So there's no reason it should come out in any ordered way. And my archive actually is quite organized. Believe it or not, under subjects. So, but I will definitely be carrying on with this and looking at new angles. It will all come under the umbrella of out of the archive, which is to restrict myself to the archive for as long as possible. And then we see where it goes from there.
Thank you very much. Pauline, do you want to say anything about what you're doing?
Well, I'm working on a research project at the University of Liverpool. So rather like you, Steve, I actually did a PhD. I decided that I wanted to move out of the day job running a gallery and go into a sort of more abstract research space. We're working on a research project that involves collecting or recollecting art that was commissioned during the years of the peace process. So again, it's about a 30-year sweep, actually, of art commissioned during the years of the peace process with a view to contributing to that process. So it's something you might call arts-based peace building. There was a huge amount of money and time and resources went into making this work, but it was never really, very rarely was it collected or examined. And so I think the commissioning bodies would be everyone from the government, the lottery, the European Union, all of these people who are, they're commissioning this work, but they're not really interested in it. No one would go and see it, and it would be in danger of being sort of lost, really. So we're recollecting it, examining it. We are hoping to be able to sort of find connections and categories in it. We'll write about it, certainly. Longer term, we've got a little website already. We're inviting people to contribute data on the work they've been involved with or they worked on as an artist. And I think the end point is that we will have a kind of repository, an online repository, which will be signpost people towards this work. So for future researchers and artists can actually find out where all this stuff is and who made it and when it was made. It's as a future resource. And the alternative is just to let it all be forgotten. That's it, yeah.
That's great. That sounds fascinating. Best of luck with that. I look forward to seeing some of the results at the end of it. And Steve, thank you very much. I would look forward to seeing the exhibition. Thanks for listening to Arts First. You can subscribe and listen to all of our episodes at our Substack website, and you can find that at artsfirst.uk, or you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or on our YouTube channel. Please give us a like or review us on any of those channels. That would be a great help. If you'd like to help with donations, then please see our Substack donations page. We'll see you next time.